The prayer, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of thy faithful, and kindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who by the light of the Holy Spirit did instruct the hearts of the faithful, grant us in the same Spirit to be ever truly wise, and ever rejoice in his consolation through Christ our Lord. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, St. Thomas Aquinas, and St. Joseph, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Well, welcome to the third week of Aristotle, and this week in this lecture we're going to be covering Aristotle's psychology, which is the division of philosophy dealing with living things. So the work in which Aristotle looks at this is the De Anima, the work on the soul. And so there are two main divisions of beings, that is living and non-living. And what gives rise to the distinction between these two is movement. Non-living things are moved externally by something outside themselves, whereas living things move themselves towards the fulfillment of the good that is proper to them. So, and that principle of self-movement, or the capacity to move itself, is life. Life is the principle of self-movement. And that principle of life is, life is principally self-movement, I want to say that. Life is principally self-movement, or the capacity to move itself, and the principle of life is the soul. So the word, the soul, in Greek is psyche, where you can recognize straight away the uses in English. We would find this word like psychology. Yeah, so psychology is the study of the soul, study of the life principle, that principle in a thing which makes it living, is the soul. So the soul, according to Aristotle, the soul is explained in terms of the hylomorphic doctrine. So we looked at that. We looked at hylomorphism when we looked at his cosmology, his philosophy of nature, in the first week. And if you remember, hylomorphism is the theory that material things are made up of matter and form. Matter being, in this case, talking about prime matter, first matter, and the form being the substantial form, that which actuates that matter. So if we keep that in mind, we'll come back to this in a moment. So that's the hylomorphic doctrine, if you remember. And so he uses this doctrine to explain the soul, because the soul, as we'll see, is the form of a living thing. So the soul, according to Aristotle, or the psyche, is defined as the entelechy of a natural body endowed with the capacity of life. So it's the soul. Now, what he means by entelechy, a Greek word, it means act. So the soul is the act, or the entelechy of a natural body endowed with the capacity for life. Or another definition he gives is the first entelechy of a natural organic body. The first entelechy, or the first act. That's another first act of a natural organic body. So there are two definitions, basically the same thing. So what does he mean by the first act here? Now it comes to understand that is we have to go back to what I talked about just a moment ago, holomorphism. So according to his holomorphic doctrine, something is made up, a material thing is made up of matter and form. So a material thing is made up of matter and form, and that matter, when we're talking about a natural thing, we're talking about here the prime matter, the first matter, the most basic matter. And if you remember what I said about that when we did this in this first week, prime matter is actually not a thing. It's a pure potency to receive act. So if you like, if you reduce the material cause of something down to its first material cause, you actually come to prime matter, which is pure potency. And that pure potency has to be actuated to give you an actual body, a material thing. And so what actuates it is the substantial form. So a material body is made up of these two things. Prime matter of substantial form gives you a body. So now the form here is, according to Aristotle, is the soul for a living thing. Now every body has prime matter substantial form, even non-living things like rocks and minerals and so on. But in the case of a living thing, the substantial form is the soul, or the psyche, as we said, for a living thing. So when he's talking about the soul as the first act, the first entelechy, what he's talking about is the substantial form, which is united with the prime matter, with the pure potency, and that gives you an actual living thing. That's what he means. So, but the way he's expressed it here, first act, yes, that's the substantial form. It's the first act that's joined to the prime matter. That gives rise to a natural organic body. So one of the purposes of the soul is not only to make something to be a living body, but also it organizes the body with its parts. So if you think about the human person is obviously a body, a living body. It has prime matter, this pure potency, the first material cause, and it has joined to it the soul, the human soul, which is its substantial form. But that soul, not only does it make something to be a human body, but it also organizes all the body. with all its organs and parts. That's why he's saying it's the first act of a natural body endowed with a capacity for life, or the first act of a natural organic body. Yeah. Because it does give rise to a body which is which is living and has parts. Yes. So yes. Now, because he's defined the soul as the form and a body as the union of matter and form, according to Aristotle, the soul is not an independent substance that's just joined or somehow to the body or imprisoned in the body. If Plato held the view that the soul pre-existed in another realm and then was entrapped or imprisoned in the body. So in other words, according to Plato, the soul had a separate existence and then entered into the body. But Aristotle rejects that view because according to him, the soul is the form of the body and doesn't have an existence without being united with the matter. Now, I'm going to qualify that because he's going to say later on that the soul can exist without the body, but it's not a separate substance when it's united to the body. So just keep that in mind. It's not as if you're joining two substances together to get a human body. You're joining matter and form, and the soul, when it's united to the matter, is not a separate substance. It's the form of it. It's the form of the body. So, right now, yes.
He thinks in terms of the soul, in our terms, like the genome. But in our terms, the genome forms what the body becomes.
Right. So the question is about whether the soul is like the genome. The genome is like a program or that sets out the ordering of that thing and what it actually, the parts and so on of that thing, but it doesn't actually give life to the thing. So really, the soul uses the genome and acts according to it. You could probably see it as like an instruction manual for that organism, but there is a soul that acts according to that genome and uses maybe that genome, but it's distinct from the genome. Yeah. So there are different types of souls according to Aristotle. So as we said, every living body has this union of matter and form, and the form is the soul. But there are different types of souls. So and just on that, I'll say something about this in a moment, but because the body, the living body, is a union of matter and form, once the soul leaves the body, then that is what death is. Yes, it's because you're separating the matter from the form, and the death of that living body. Because the soul, remember, is the life principle, is that which gives life to the body. But so there are three souls you can talk about, or life principles. Now, when we use the word soul or psyche in the Greek, but in the English, when we use the word soul, we tend to use it only for human souls. But Aristotle uses this term psyche or soul even for other organisms, not only humans. So you have a vegetative soul, which is that of plants, yes. And there are three functions of that soul. It has reproduction, nutrition, and growth. Reproduction, nutrition, growth. They're three operations or functions of vegetative soul. Then you have sensitive soul. And the sensitive soul is that of animals. Yes. By the way, the very use of the very word animal comes from anima, and anima is soul. Yes. So, but here, animals have a particular type of soul, which is distinct from the plant soul. So, now what distinguishes the sensitive soul from the vegetative soul is that animals also have sensation. Appetite or desire. And local motion. Plants don't have these things. Sensation, appetite, or desire, sensible desire, and local motion. They can change position. Yes, so this is the point. So the higher soul has everything that the lower soul has. So the sensitive soul has reproduction, nutrition, growth, plus more. It has this as well. And then you have the third soul is the highest soul, which is the intellective soul. Or the rational soul. So again, the intellective soul has everything that the vegetative and sentient soul has, but in addition, it also has knowledge. Now we could say intellect, yes, as well. The Greek word is nous, and deliberation. We could say will as well. I could give you the Greek if you like, but don't worry about the Greek. So if you like, intellect and will, he uses the word knowledge, deliberation. So sensitive things and plants don't have these two. And this is what distinguishes rational man from beasts and plants. Now, yes.
What sort of time period are we talking here? Like when Aristotle sort of came up, is there a time period where you think that happened?
Well, we know, yeah, well, we're looking at 4th century BC, yeah. So
it's interesting with people today that 2 and 3 are the same, wouldn't they? They'd say humans are the same as animals.
Right, yeah, there can be yes, a failure to distinguish in some modern thinkers. Yeah, they don't they see humans as simply animals, maybe with higher functions, but nothing, no extra faculties or distinct from animals. You know, but Aristotle does see it having intellect and will distinguishes man. That's how he defines man, as a rational animal. That's the definition he gives of man. So man has rationality, knowledge, and deliberation. But he's also an animal. He has sensitive, but also vegetative. Now there is a even though man has this type of soul, he does, as we said, have these lower functions as well. But he doesn't have three souls. Now, in terms of the Platonic understanding, it's also, and the Neoplatonists speak in terms of one thing, a living body, having more than one soul. And Aristotle rejects that, and after him, St. Thomas would reject that as well. We don't have three souls, because according to Aristotle, that would compromise the unity of the thing. We don't have three souls. We have one soul, but it's a superior soul because it includes what the lower souls have. Right. So it's just something about, I'll say something more in detail about the sensitive soul. As we said, so if we look at just the sensitive for the time being, so we've already given here what distinguishes the sensitive from the vegetative. So if you remember when we looked at the theory, well, I mentioned about matter and form distinction. Now, what does it mean to know something, to have sensation, say, which is something of all animals have this, including man. What does it mean to know something? According to Aristotle, to know means to possess the form of the thing known. Knowledge is a type of immaterial possession of form, as opposed to a material or natural possession of the form. So if we're looking at the level of what sensation is, it is a reception of some type of sensible form from the thing that is sensed. That's how Aristotle explains it. So, for example, if we're, for example, seeing color, Aristotle would explain that in terms of a sensible form of color going from the object that is sensed into the eye. In other words, there's a transfer of form, some type of sensible form from the thing into the eye. Now, it's not the actual form that's in the thing. It doesn't leave the object and come into the eye, but there's some type of transfer of that form into the sense organ, and that goes for all the senses. So it's, if you like, an impression of that sensible form onto the sense organ. That's how he explains sensation. And the analogy he uses is wax, which has the impression of a ring in it. If you remember, in the past, they would make a seal. I think we've probably seen it recently with the papal, after the death of the Pope, they destroyed the seal, the papal seal, which would be impressed in wax, and then that would be used to give an indication this is an authentic document or whatever. So Aristotle says, as a ring, a signet ring leaves an impression in wax of its form. it doesn't, the ring doesn't remain in the wax, but the impression of that ring is left in the wax. So something similar happens when we sense an object, and that form, like color or taste, flavor, for example, leaves an impression on the sense organ, like a signet ring impressing a wax. That's the analogy Aristotle gives in the De Anima. And so if you like, sense knowledge is the reception of a sensible form. Now, if we're talking about sensation, Aristotle distinguishes between the external senses and the internal senses. So we know what the external senses are. So we have the five. So there are 5 external senses. So you have sight, touch, taste, hearing, smell. Yeah. 5 external senses, and these are divided. The objects of these senses are of 2 kinds. So he says there are proper sensibles, that is to say, those things that are proper to the sense organ, to that sense organ, and there are common sensibles, which are things that can be sensed by more than one sense organ. So there are 2 objects of external senses. Proper sensibles and common sensibles. So every organ has things that are proper to it. Like, for example, sight has colored light. We don't need to go through all of them, but there are proper sense objects for each sense, and there are common ones. An example he gives is the figure or shape of an object. For example, you can see the shape of an object, but you can also feel it. So it's common. It's a common sensible. But in addition to these 5 external senses, I just might lob this out. Five external senses. He also has 4 internal senses. So these are firstly common sense, imagination, common sense, imagination, memory, estimative sense. Now, I don't have time to explain this in any real detail, but the common sense is the sense which unifies what the external senses give us. So, and they also distinguish one sense from another. So that's why it's called common, because it takes in the data from the different senses to give us a common experience of that sensed object. And also, as I said, it distinguishes one sense from another. Example, how do I know the difference between what I smell and what I touch and what I taste? All this data comes into the common sense, and the common sense distinguishes one from another, and also gives us a unified perception of an object. For example, you can smell a rose, you can see a rose, you can feel a rose, and we have a common conception, a percept, what we call, of that rose, which that's the result of the common sense unifying the sense data. And then the imagination. So according to Aristotle, the imagination is a storehouse of images. So when we sense an object, for example, if I see a tree, I can close my eyes and I have the image of it in my imagination. So the imagination is a storehouse of images. It's a storehouse of individual images that we sense. But imagination does more than that. It also enables objects to be reconfigured into new objects. For example, we can imagine a unicorn, which is a combination of qualities of a horse and a horned animal. Now, there are no unicorns in existence, but we can imagine one because it results of the imagination combining the data of the different things that we have sensed and that we have images of. So that's the function of imagination, storehouse of images. And the memory is similar in a way, but what distinguishes memory from imagination is that it remembers things that we have sensed as past. We know them as past. So rather than simply as images, we know them as past images or past experiences. And then the estimative sense, the best way to understand that is a type of instinct that animals have and humans have as well. For example, animals know instinctively what is good for them and what is bad for them. Like a sheep, when it sees a wolf, it doesn't have to be instructed about that the wolf is bad for it. It just runs. It has a natural instinct. This is what the estimative sense is. It's a sense of what is good or bad for the animal. Yes. We have a sort of estimative, high animals like humans, he calls that a cogitative sense. It's a highly developed form of estimative sense. And the higher animals have high levels of this sense, which in some sense is analogous to intellect in a way, especially the higher animals. But it's not intellect, only humans have, as we saw, a rational soul. I'll just mention briefly also the appetites, which is important for Aristotle's psychology. And again, everything that I've been saying so far is for sensitive souls. We'll be just looking at sensitive souls, animals, in other words, and humans, of course, who possess these functions as well. I'll just mention the appetites. Now, according to Aristotle, there are two types of appetites, concupiscible and irascible. And those appetites give rise to passions, which are acts of those appetites. So the concupiscible is the first group. And of the concupiscible, we have 6. Oh, sorry, wrong order here. Love, hate. Desire, aversion. Joy, sorrow. Obviously, these are contrary pairs. Love, hate, desire, aversion, joy, sorrow. So they're called concupiscible appetites because they're appetites which draw us to something which is desirable and good. So the word concupiscence means desire. Yes. So the concupiscible appetites, but this is the order in which the concupiscible appetites operate. So for example, first we have love of something. No, you love it. That's why you desire it. Yeah. For example, you love chocolate cake, then you desire it, you want it, and then when you consume it, you have joy. Yes. If you hate chocolate cake, you have an aversion for it, and you try to avoid it, which is a very rare aversion, I think. And then if you should eat it or have to eat it, you'll have sorrow. Yes, maybe something else would be a better example than chocolate cake. I know some people who hate fish. They don't like eating fish, but so this is the order. So now love here, when he's talking about love, he's talking about sensible love or love as a concupiscible appetite, which is not love, which is rational love. This type of love is found with dogs and cats. Dogs and cats love, a certain food, for example. A dog might like a bone. It loves that bone. It desires the bone, and it gets joy from chewing on that bone. So we share that with animals. It's the appetites, and in fact, the sensitive soul or the sensitive faculties of the human soul, as I said, are shared with animals, and but it's the lower part of our human nature, because human nature has the sensitive, the animal, and also the rational. So this type of love is a concupiscible love. It is that love, as I said, for things that are pleasurable, like chocolate cake. The main types of loves are food, drink, and sexuality. Yes, they're the 3 principal loves which we share with animals. Yes.
What about beauty?
Sorry?
What about beauty?
That's a higher order, yes. Beauty involves intellect and will, the appreciation of beauty. Something animals don't have, the appreciation of beauty. You need intellect and will. So this is at the level of the animal level, what we're talking about here.
So when people say things like, virtue love is not it's not inaccurate typically. I always
Yeah.
thought it was a misuse of the word,
Yes.
like in the
It is, yeah. So you can talk about love, concupiscible love, the appetite is correct. But there is obviously the virtue of love or charity, which is an intellectual virtue, and that resides in the soul. And that's something obviously animals don't have. They lack the virtue of charity or love. That's why it's better. Well, we can talk about love also on a higher level, not only the virtue of charity, but we talk about love at the higher level, which is an act of the will, which animals don't have. They only have this type of love, but we can talk about. So we're talking here about irrational love. We talk about a rational love, which is an act of the will, which is found in humans but not in animals. And yes, and if you then add the virtue of charity, which is it's something even greater. It's a theological virtue. Yes. So
there's a fine line with them. I had a cat whose kitten fell into this underground tank. It was about 20 feet deep. Mother didn't hesitate. Went straight in after.
yes.
With absolutely no hope of ever getting out again. Don't you think that's getting very close to like a self-sacrificing love that we talk about? For instance, with Jesus sacrificing his life for humanity.
Yes. But I suppose I would say the question is a cat, for example, jumping into a well or something to save its kitten is, yes, it is so something analogous to a self-sacrificing act of a human, but that act of the cat is not a deliberate, rational choice. It's an instinctive thing. Like the cat as a mother is doing that. Is preserving offspring. Whereas humans, yes, they have that as well. The mother has an instinctive, because we are animals, so we do have that estimative sense as well, as I said, an instinctual sort of understanding of what is good and what is needed. But we also have obviously intellect and will, and we can deliberately choose to do that. So see, the mother cat trying to save its kitten is not really doing something meritorious. It's just acting instinctively. Yes, whereas humans can reflect and consider what they do and make a deliberate act of the will to do something. Yes, because they do have that, as we said, deliberation, that faculty of deliberation, choice. So they're the concupiscible, and then the other appetites are called the irascible. And the irascible appetites are hope, despair, courage, and fear, and anger. So again, you can see these are pairs, but anger is not a pair. Now, I won't go into why anger is not a pair. There is an explanation for that, but for our purposes now, you just see these two are pairs and anger is not. So irascible comes from the word anger, in word for anger in Latin. That's why it's called irascible. And so, yes, you can see the contraries here. And so the irascible appetites whereas these appetites are concerned with things which are pleasurable, the irascible appetites are concerned with overcoming difficulties. So the irascible appetites, you can see here, hope enables one to overcome a difficulty that we might be in. Hope enables us to continue on, despite difficulties. Or courage, when we're faced with a difficult situation, courage helps us to overcome that. Anger as well if someone is animated by anger, it can motivate them also to overcome some difficulty. I suppose it's I suppose giving. Here we're talking about just the appetite, not any virtue. So if we have fear, the way to overcome fear is with courage. The way to overcome despair is hope. We're dealing with these appetites here, not virtues at this level.
They exist in that way. They can both exist to some extent. It's kind of like a struggle.
Yeah, there is. Yes. So yes. Yeah. So there are these appetites sort of drawing us to fear or drawing us to courage. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So animals have this as well. Yes. Yeah. They have hope, but they have hope, not the virtue of hope. Yeah. We're not talking here about the virtue of hope, which is only found in man, and obviously the theological virtue of hope. Obviously that doesn't exist in them, but they do have hope. For example, a dog who's trapped or something, it needs hope in order for it to continue fighting to get out, not to give up. If it doesn't have hope, it won't continue. Yes, sort of despair. And as I said, these appetites, when there are acts of these appetites, they're called passions. So we can talk about the concupiscible and irascible passions, which are acts of these appetites. So I suppose in modern language, we could call them emotions. So the passions are, in a sense, like in modern psychology, talking about the emotions. We could talk about, for example, fear as an emotion, but Aristotle uses the term passion. It's the act of the appetite is the passion. So you could say therefore, since there are 6 concupiscible and 5 irascible appetites, there are also 6 concupiscible passions and 5 irascible passions. A lot more can be said about that, but I won't because I want to go on. And so, again, this is everything that I've said so far is in relation to the sensitive soul. Now, I want to say something importantly about the rational soul. So man has a rational soul. And as I said, the question of how we know something, on the level of sensation, I gave Aristotle gives the example of a signet ring leaving an impression in wax. That signet ring is of a sensible form, leaving an impression on the sense organ. Something analogous happens with the intellect. The intellect is impressed with a form of the thing that is known. So here we're dealing with not sensible forms, but intelligible forms. So, for example, what does it mean to know intellectually, to know a tree, for example, and to form the idea of a tree? Means to have that form of that tree somehow impressed on our intellect, giving rise to the idea of a tree. So now I'll say something more about that in a moment. So right, if you look, I might just give a brief overview of how Aristotle sees us forming an idea. I'll just leave it at the level of idea. So they were talking about intellectual knowledge. How does the soul have intellectual knowledge? As I said, I've talked about sense knowledge as an impression of sensible forms. So I'll just give you a rough outline. I can't talk about it in detail about how this occurs. So you start with some object which is sensed. That then is sensed by the external sense, which we talked about. There are 5 external senses. For example, you might see an object, for example. Then there's the internal sense, especially of imagination, which is Aristotle talks about, especially imagination. So what we mean here is, all right, you, for example, see an object like a tree with your external senses, and then you form an image of that tree in your imagination. Even if you should close your eyes or move away from the tree, you still have that tree as an image in your imagination. And then from that imagination, that image, the active intellect abstracts the form of the thing. So Aristotle talks about the intellect under 2 aspects, if you like. It's not that we have 2 intellects, but we have an active intellect and a passive intellect. So the active intellect abstracts the form. So in your, after sensing a tree, for example, and having an image of a tree, the active intellect abstracts or draws out, if you like, the form of the tree. It's able to do that. It's able to. Now, obviously, the tree retains its own form. It doesn't lose the form that is in it, although otherwise it would cease to be a tree. But the intellect is able to, if you like, get a representation of that form into itself by drawing out that form. Yeah, in a way, like the wax. Yes, the ring remains in the shape of the ring remains in the ring, but it leaves an impression on the wax. So the form of the tree remains in the tree, but somehow through the active intellect drawing out that form, it leaves an impression on the intellect.
This is something you have to you can't just look at a tree and that's a tree. So is this something that we do, intellectual knowledge, something, or it's something that we learn?
Well, this is something it happens without learning, because even a young child, anyone who has senses, and has an intellect will be able to form an idea of a tree. They may not understand that it is called a tree. They may not attach that name tree to it, but they spontaneously form the idea of a tree. As soon as you see a tree, your intellect abstracts, the active intellect draws out that form of the tree, and then forms an idea from that. And then we could be told, the child could be told, the child might ask, what is that? And the parent says it's a tree. But the child already has the idea of a tree already formed in its intellect. So, chocolate cake, right? Yes, the concupiscible appetite will be there, drawing it to that cake. So, but there's also, if you like, I'm continuing here, the passive intellect. So, as I said, it's not that Aristotle says there are two intellects, but there's an active function of drawing out, abstracting the form of the thing, and a passive intellect of impressing that form on the intellect. It's so there has a function, an active function of drawing out, abstracting, and a function of impressing. So the intellect, as being impressed by that form, gives rise to the idea. So at this stage, you have an idea formed. So, well, I might write it here. It's not to confuse you. It gives rise to an idea. So you might draw out the form of a tree, and then the passive intellect is impressed by that form and gives rise to the idea of a tree, for example, in that example. Yes. So more can be said on this, but we don't have time. I'm just giving you the rough outline of how he sees intellectual knowledge as arising. But what you notice, and this is Aristotle is very clear about that all intellectual knowledge, like ideas which are formed by the intellect, come into existence via the senses. So nothing is in the intellect which is not first in the senses. That is a general principle. It's a scholastic principle, but it can be applied to Aristotle because he clearly holds this as well. Nothing is in the intellect which is not first in the senses. The senses are the gateways, the doorways of human intellectual knowledge, on the natural level anyway. That's the case. So I just want to say something now about an important question about the soul, whether the soul is something immaterial or spiritual. Right. So the question, is the soul something material or is it immaterial? Now, Aristotle says that the human soul is immaterial. It's not material, it's immaterial. And the reason he gives for saying that is that because the intellect can receive intelligible forms from material things, it can abstract intelligible forms. It must be distinct from those material things. So because it can know, the intellect can know all material things, it must be distinct from a material thing, because it wouldn't have the capacity to know all things if it was a material organ. Because according to Aristotle, a material organ, if it was material, like if the intellect was material, it would be limited as a result in what it can know. And so, but the fact that it can know, the intellect can know all things, must be, it's not, therefore it's not material. Its immateriality makes it more open to knowing all things, according to Aristotle. So another way to consider this is the principle action follows being. Something acts in the way that it is. So because the human soul can form ideas which are immaterial, it must itself be immaterial. Because ideas are not material. And you can put someone's brain under a microscope and you never find an idea. you can't see it because it's not something which is material. It's something immaterial. It resides in fact in an immaterial soul. And Aristotle says the way something acts is, if you like, follows from the way it is. So the fact that the soul is able to know immaterial things like ideas means that the soul must be immaterial as well. So the intellect can form ideas, as we said, by abstracting the forms of things, and it can know those things because it is in fact also immaterial. And as I said, if it was just a corporeal organ, it would be limited to knowing only. It will be limited in what it can know.
Is that a point in Harvard then about that we can know immaterial things as well as material things? Knowledge that we can consider spiritual knowledge, not something we can see, have form ideas about.
Right, we can, yes. Yes, we can form ideas, but even those ideas that we form of immaterial things, like God, for example, or the soul, is ultimately derived from the knowledge we have of material things as well. Yes. The soul obviously is not something we sense. We think about, we come to know the soul, its existence, from reason applying itself to our experience. But that experience is, in its first origin, something sensible, something given to the senses. But yes, the intellect can go beyond the sensible world. Yes, it can go beyond the sensible world to the immaterial, to the non-material. Yes, like God or the soul. Yes, and the thing, a distinction between sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge. Sense knowledge is of individual things. For example, I see this particular tree, and I form an image of this particular tree, for example. But intellectual knowledge can be of universals. Like my idea of tree doesn't apply to only this tree, but to all trees. So this is what distinguishes intellectual knowledge from sense knowledge. Intellectual knowledge is of the universal, whereas sense knowledge is always of the singular thing. So this also points to what I said, because the intellect can know all things and know them as universals, as ideas. The soul is not a physical organ. Yeah. Now modern psychology, the way it speaks, it equates the human mind or the intellect with an organ, with the brain, whereas Aristotle would reject that. Obviously, there is a brain, but the intellect is an immaterial faculty. It's not a material faculty. It's an immaterial faculty which happens to use a material faculty, the brain, or a material organ rather, the brain. But the intellect is not equated with the brain. Yes. And so therefore the soul can in fact exist outside the body, and can still think and reason even without a brain. It's not actually, we could say, it's not intrinsically dependent on an organ. It's extrinsically dependent on it. Yeah. Because the human intellect can exist, well, the human soul and its faculty, the intellect, can exist without a body. Yeah. Yes. And Aristotle, in fact, points to that. One, because he says it is immaterial. And he seems to, now he's not very clear as he should be on this, but there's definitely indications that he says the soul is something immaterial. That's very clear, he argues, it's immaterial. So therefore it can survive death because it's not dependent on matter. So, certainly he talks about the active intellect as doing that, but the active intellect is just it's not distinct from the passive intellect. It's one intellect considering the two aspects. So the fact that the intellect is something, and the operations of the intellect are something immaterial, the soul is immaterial and can survive death. Yes. So, right. So if it was, it does use the brain, yeah. So what we could say that the intellect or the soul, the human soul is, and therefore the faculty of the intellect is intrinsically or extrinsically dependent on the brain. So extrinsically means insofar as the soul is united to the body, it uses the organ of the brain. But it's not actually intrinsically dependent on it, because separated from the soul, from the brain or from the body, it can still think. Yeah. So that's why if we get a brain injury, it does affect our ability to think, because our soul is still joined to our body. But once it's separated from the body, it won't be dependent on the brain. It will be still able to think. Yeah. And in fact, it will think even better, because the brain is a physical organ which restricts us. And we all know that, if you get a headache or whatever, you get dementia, you can't think. Well, that's why angels are so superior to men, to humans, because they don't have any matter. Their intellection is not impeded by an organ. Now ours is not impeded when the soul is separated from the body, but it is in this life. It is, it's restricted by the material organ. Now the next thing I'll just touch briefly, I've already touched on that, is the soul. So according to Aristotle, the soul is immaterial. The rational soul, that is. The rational soul is immaterial. He doesn't say that of animal souls. Animal souls are not immaterial. Animal souls don't survive the death of the animal. Fido, when he dies, that's the end of Fido. His sensitive soul is not annihilated; it's absorbed back into matter, but that's another thing. But his sensitive soul does not survive death. Whereas Aristotle is clear that the rational soul is something immaterial. It's not intrinsically dependent on matter, because, as I said, the way the intellect thinks, it uses ideas which are something immaterial, and therefore not dependent on matter. So the rational soul is immaterial, and it's also immortal. And the immortality of the soul follows from it being immaterial, because material things can be broken down and decomposed, but an immaterial thing can't. It's Aristotle does say that the soul, the rational soul, is immortal. It survives death. This is just a quote from another work, not the De Anima, the On Generation of Animals. Aristotle says, reason alone enters from the outside, and it alone is divine. So he's actually saying it is like the divine, it is like God in a way, because it is immaterial and immortal. Yes. Coming from outside, we could say, you could interpret that as meaning it's something transcendent. It transcends the body. It's not dependent on the body.
What was that quote again? Reason alone.
Reason alone enters from the outside, and it alone is divine. From the work On Generation of Animals. He also says, this is a quote from the De Anima, he says, when mind is set free from its present conditions, it appears as just what it is and nothing more. This alone is immortal and eternal. So he's talking about the immortality and eternity of the soul. In particular, the rational soul he's talking about here. He's talking about mind, which is not nous, which is only found in rational creatures. Yes. So something, though, which I wouldn't agree with Aristotle, he says that memory ceases when we die. So even though the soul survives the body, it doesn't have any memory. So he probably because memory is related to images and sense images, which are part of the lower part of the soul. So that only the upper part of the soul and its faculties sort of, according to Aristotle, survive, not the lower functions, not the animal functions. So that's probably why he says memory does not survive death. But Sir Thomas doesn't agree with that, I think, in his commentary on this, on Aristotle. Yes. There have been different views of, because Aristotle is not always completely clear about this. He talks about the agent intellect or the active intellect surviving death. Some commentators, like some of the Muslim philosophers, have thought that there is one common active intellect that all people share. But that's not what Aristotle meant. But there have been commentators who have said that. But what is clear is that Aristotle does say that the soul is immaterial, as I said, and something immortal, which is a great advance on a philosophical advance, on the understanding of the human person, that he has a rational soul. We see this. Plato also talked about the soul surviving death. So, but his understanding of what the soul is not as developed as Aristotle, and the rational defense of the immaterial soul is not as developed in Plato as in Aristotle. We pause there. Yes.